The courthouse had always been a place of quiet authority, hardwood benches, polished by years of nervous hands, high ceilings that echoed the shuffle of footsteps, and walls lined with portraits of judges from generations past. But that morning, it felt different. It wasn't just another trial. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of unspoken tension that settled over everyone who had squeezed into the small-town courtroom. Reporters jostled for position near the back, their notebooks and cameras ready. Families of the victims sat in solemn rows, whispering prayers under their breath. Lawyers shuffled papers, pretending to look calm. The defendant, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, sat at the front, his eyes shifting restlessly between the judge and the jurors. He had been accused of a crime that had shaken the town to its core. A violent act committed in the shadows of night, one that left scars both seen and unseen. The evidence was strong, but not unshakable. Witnesses had faltered, testimonies had been challenged, and the defense attorney's confident smirk told the world he believed victory was still within reach. Then the prosecutor stood. His voice was steady, but his words carried an unexpected weight. "Your Honor," he said, "the state would like to call its next witness." The judge, an older man with silver hair and deep lines carved into his face, adjusted his glasses and nodded. When the prosecutor announced the name, the courtroom reacted instantly. Heads turned. Gasps echoed. A ripple of confusion ran through the gallery. "A child?" Someone whispered. Mothers pulled their children closer. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the jurors exchanged puzzled glances. The defense attorney barked a laugh under his breath, shaking his head. "They're desperate," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and every whisper stopped. She was tiny, just 3 years old. Her yellow dress looked almost too big for her small frame, and she clutched a worn teddy bear so tightly that its faded button eyes seemed ready to pop off. Her hair, tied into 2 uneven pigtails, bounced gently as she walked, her free hand clutching her mother's fingers for courage. If that had been all, the scene might have been touching but ordinary. But she wasn't alone. Beside her walked a massive German shepherd, his coat a gleaming mix of black and tan, his eyes alert yet calm. A leather harness around his chest bore the unmistakable badge of law enforcement. On his back, the words Police K9 Comfort Unit were stitched in bold white letters. The sight was so unexpected, so unusual, that the entire room fell into stunned silence. The little girl's steps were hesitant at first, but the dog matched her pace, his head held high, his stride steady. Every time her grip on her teddy loosened, she reached down to brush her fingers against the dog's fur, as if drawing strength from his presence. The child didn't look at the crowd staring at her. She didn't look at the defendant. She didn't even glance at the reporters craning their necks to see her. Her focus was only on the dog beside her, her anchor in the storm. The judge leaned forward, visibly taken aback. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his tone more curious than angry. The prosecutor quickly explained. "Your Honor, the witness is 3 years old. She has been through trauma no child should ever endure. The dog is a trained comfort animal, provided by law enforcement to help children testify in difficult cases. He is here to ensure she feels safe enough to speak the truth." The defense attorney scoffed loudly. "This is a circus," he snapped. "A stunt designed to pull on the jury's heartstrings. A child this young cannot possibly provide reliable testimony." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. His gaze returned to the child, who was now being helped into the witness chair. The chair looked enormous beneath her, like a throne far too big for its occupant. She swung her legs nervously, her teddy bear perched on her lap. The dog, Rex, lay at her feet, his body stretched out protectively, his eyes sweeping the room. The jurors, once skeptical, now leaned forward with rapt attention. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen countless trials in his career, couldn't help but soften his expression as he watched the scene unfold. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly still. The only sounds were the scratching of reporters' pens and the faint hum of the overhead lights. The judge's voice was softer now, almost paternal. "Young lady," he said gently, "can you tell us your name?" The little girl hesitated, glancing down at Rex. Her hand slid into his thick fur, and she gave a tiny nod, as if reassured. "Maddie," she whispered into the microphone. Her voice was so small, so fragile, yet it carried through the silent courtroom with startling clarity. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing this was no ordinary witness. "Thank you, Maddie," the judge said with a kind smile. "Do you know why you're here today?" Maddie's big eyes flicked toward the defendant. Her lips trembled. The teddy bear in her lap shook as she squeezed it tightly. Then, with a quick glance at Rex, she whispered, "Because I saw him." Gasps rippled across the room. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is outrageous. She's too young. She's been coached." "Overruled," the judge said firmly, though his eyes betrayed his own shock. Maddie leaned forward slightly, her small voice trembling but determined. "He hurt my mommy." The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever experienced. It wasn't just silence, it was the kind of stillness that wrapped around the heart, heavy and unshakable. Even seasoned officers in the back row shifted uncomfortably, their stoic faces betraying emotion. Rex rested his head on Maddie's tiny shoes, his eyes never leaving the accused. It was as if he understood the gravity of the moment, as if he too were standing guard over the fragile truth about to be revealed. For the first time in the trial, the confident smirk vanished from the defense attorney's face. For the first time, the defendant himself broke eye contact, his shoulders stiffening. The jurors were no longer skeptical. They were transfixed. And in that single moment, before any testimony had even truly begun, the fate of the trial shifted. The unlikely witness, barely 3 years old, had already frozen the courtroom with the weight of her presence. What she would say next would not just decide the trial, it would etch itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. The hush that had fallen over the courtroom after Maddie's soft words lingered, heavy and unbroken. Everyone had expected nerves, maybe tears, perhaps even silence from a child so young. But no one had anticipated the quiet certainty with which she spoke. And just as powerful as her presence was the figure at her side, the German shepherd who had walked her into the courtroom, like a guardian knight escorting a princess. Rex wasn't just any dog. He was a police canine, specially trained in comfort duty, a relatively new program in the state. For years, service dogs had been used to aid veterans, people with disabilities, and survivors of trauma. But this program was different. These dogs weren't meant to sniff out drugs or chase criminals down dark alleys. They were meant to sit beside children like Maddie children who had witnessed horrors they couldn't fully understand and lend them the kind of courage no adult words could provide. Rex had been handpicked for this job. He had the strength of a warrior and the gentleness of a guardian. In training, he had learned how to sense a child's fear, how to press his warm body close when small shoulders trembled, how to hold still when tiny fingers tugged at his fur. And now, in this moment, he was fulfilling that duty perfectly. As Maddie sat in the oversized chair, her legs dangling far above the ground, Rex positioned himself at her feet. He didn't fidget. He didn't break eye contact with the room. His presence radiated calm. Every few moments, Maddie would glance down, find his dark eyes watching her, and her trembling lips would steady. The jury noticed. One of the jurors, a middle-aged father of 3, found his throat tightening as he watched the small girl lean down just slightly. brushing her fingers through the thick fur on Rex's neck. It reminded him of his youngest daughter, who often sought their family dog whenever thunder rattled the windows at night. He shifted in his chair, realizing that the bond unfolding in front of him wasn't a performance. It was instinct, pure and unfiltered. The defense attorney, however, saw things differently. He leaned across the table toward his client, whispering sharply, "This is theater. Nothing more. The jury's being manipulated by a dog and a teddy bear. Don't worry, we'll cut through it." But despite his words, his eyes flickered nervously toward Rex. Something about the dog unsettled him. Perhaps it was how still Rex remained, or how his gaze seemed almost human in its steadiness. The prosecutor adjusted his tie and walked closer to the witness stand. His tone was gentle, his pace slow, as though approaching a bird that might take flight at the slightest sudden move. "Maddie," he said softly, "do you remember when you first met Rex?" Maddie blinked, her little fingers wrapping tighter around her teddy bear. She gave a shy nod. "Can you tell us about that?" The prosecutor encouraged. Her lips parted, and for the first time, her words carried a small hint of warmth. "He came to see me," she whispered, her eyes still on Rex, "at the police place. I was scared, but he let me hug him. He didn't move. He just stayed." Rex, as though understanding his name was being spoken, lifted his head proudly. Maddie smiled a fragile but real smile. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, caught by the sudden brightness in the child's expression. The prosecutor let the silence linger just long enough, then asked, "And does Rex help you feel safe?" "Yes," Maddie said. Her voice was clearer now. "He makes the scary go away." Her answer, simple as it was, struck the courtroom like a bell. The defense attorney was on his feet in an instant. "Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness. The prosecution is using this animal to elicit emotional responses that have nothing to do with the facts of this case." The judge regarded him with cool eyes. Overruled. This child's ability to testify is directly connected to her comfort and sense of safety. The presence of the canine is justified. The defense attorney sat down, his jaw tight. His client shifted in his seat, staring at the floor. Meanwhile, Maddie had leaned down once more, resting her small hand on Rex's broad back. She whispered something, too soft for anyone else to hear, but the dog's ears twitched as though he understood. The bailiff, watching from the side, found himself strangely moved. He'd worked dozens of cases involving children. Most of them had been nightmares, kids crying uncontrollably, parents begging judges to excuse them, attorneys battling over every word. But this was different. The dog was a bridge between a terrified child and a courtroom that would normally swallow her whole. As the questioning continued, Maddie grew steadier. Each time she faltered, Rex was there, unmoving, unblinking, his steady presence reminding her she wasn't alone. The prosecutor didn't push her too hard, but he began to gently guide her toward the night that had changed everything. The jurors listened in rapt silence. Even the reporters, usually eager to catch every detail for the next headline, slowed their pens. They knew they were watching something rare, not just testimony, but the fragile unfolding of courage. The defendant, however, shifted uncomfortably. He stared at the little girl with an expression that hovered between disdain and unease. When her eyes flicked toward him, she shrank back slightly, her teddy clutched tighter. But then Rex shifted, pressing his head against her leg, and she steadied again. The message was clear even if she couldn't articulate it herself. She wasn't afraid anymore, not with Rex beside her. The judge watched all of this closely, his hand resting against his chin. In all his years on the bench, he had never seen a witness so young. He had doubted whether the testimony would hold any weight at all. But watching Maddie gather strength through the dog's presence, he realized this wasn't just admissible, It was vital. After nearly 30 minutes, the prosecutor paused, giving Maddie a chance to rest. The courtroom remained utterly still. Then the judge leaned forward, his voice warm but authoritative. "You're very brave, Maddie," he said. "Thank you for speaking to us today." The little girl nodded, her small hand never leaving Rex's fur. For a moment, she looked almost like any other child, safe and secure in the company of a loyal pet. But everyone in that room knew she was more than that. She was the key witness in a case that could determine justice. And as she sat there, dwarfed by the chair, but steadied by the faithful German shepherd at her side, the courtroom understood something profound. Rex wasn't a stunt, wasn't theater. He was a lifeline. Without him, Maddie's truth might never have found its way into the light. The jurors, the lawyers, even the skeptical defense, every one of them had felt it. The smallest voice in the room had been carried forward by the silent strength of a dog with a duty. And the story was only just beginning. The courtroom had grown used to noise lawyers debating, pens scratching, the faint whir of cameras, the shuffle of shoes against tile. But now, as Maddie sat in the witness chair, one hand gripping her teddy bear and the other resting on Rex's fur, the silence was almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls, thick and unyielding. Even the air conditioning hum, usually a faint background drone, felt muted under the weight of expectation. Everyone was waiting for her, this child so impossibly small, yet so impossibly important to speak. The prosecutor leaned forward, careful not to move too fast. He knew how delicate the moment was. "Maddie," he said gently, his voice soft enough to sound like a teacher's, but strong enough to carry across the room. "Do you remember the night we talked about?" The little girl lowered her eyes. Her legs swung nervously back and forth from the tall chair, her shoes scuffing the wood. She pressed her teddy close, burying her nose against its worn fur, as though searching for courage. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between her and the man at the defense table. The defendant sat stiff, his eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something, but he gave no reply. His gaze never left Maddie, and for a moment, it seemed as though the child could feel the weight of his stare. She shuddered visibly. Her small hand reached instinctively for Rex. The dog stirred, pressing closer to the stand, his head nudging against her knee. The movement was slow, deliberate reassurance wrapped in fur. Maddie's trembling slowed, her tiny shoulders straightening as though the animal had loaned her part of his strength. The prosecutor spoke again. "It's okay. You're safe here. Can you tell us what you remember?" The silence stretched long and painful. Some in the audience thought she might not answer at all. Reporters began writing quick notes in the margins of their pads. Child too scared to testify? Ready to turn hesitation into a headline. The defense attorney smirked, leaning back in his chair, as though the trial were already swinging in his favor. But then Maddie's lips parted. I was there," she whispered. The words were so faint, they might have been missed, but the courtroom was so still that even the smallest sound carried. Heads snapped up. The prosecutor nodded gently. "You were there? Where were you, Maddie?" Her eyes flicked to the defendant and back down again. She swallowed hard. "At home," she said. "With Mommy." The prosecutor moved an inch closer. "That's very brave, Maddie. Can you tell us what happened when you were at home?" Maddie clutched her teddy so tightly the seams creaked. Her voice quivered, but she pressed forward, each word drawn out like pulling threads from a tangled knot. "I heard shouting, loud shouting." The jury leaned in. Pens froze above paper. "My mommy told me to hide. She said, 'Go under the table, Maddie. Don't come out.'" A juror gasped softly, covering her mouth. The rest of the jury sat frozen. The picture Maddie painted too vivid, too raw. The prosecutor kept his tone low and even. "And did you hide, sweetheart?" Maddie nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I went under the table. I held Teddy really tight. I closed my eyes, but—" She hesitated, her throat tightening. I could still hear everything. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. This is a frightened toddler repeating words fed to her by her mother." The judge's gavel struck once. Overruled. The jury will determine credibility. The defense attorney sat down, scowling. But his eyes betrayed unease. He knew what everyone else could see. The child wasn't coached. Her halting speech, her unpolished words, her stammering pauses, they were the raw recounting of memory, not the product of rehearsal. The prosecutor crouched slightly, lowering himself to her eye level. "Maddie, when you were under the table, what did you see?" The room tensed, leaning collectively forward as though drawn by invisible string. This was the moment. This was the testimony that could turn the entire case. Maddie blinked, a tear rolling down her cheek. She reached again for Rex, pressing her small fingers into his thick fur. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, simply sat like a statue of loyalty. Finally, Maddie looked up. Her gaze, so wide and so fragile, locked for a moment on the man at the defense table. Her lips trembled. "I saw." "Him." The words cracked like thunder. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The victim's family, seated in the front row, clutched each other's hands, tears streaming silently. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor. Even the bailiff, a man hardened by years of grim proceedings, shifted uncomfortably. The defendant stiffened, his eyes narrowing, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles whitened. His lawyer leaned toward him in alarm, whispering furiously, but he didn't move. The prosecutor's voice was steady, but his heart pounded. "Maddie, are you sure it was him?" "The man sitting right there." The little girl nodded. Her finger rose, trembling, and pointed directly at the accused. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of hesitation anymore. It was the silence of impact, of truth, landing in the hearts of everyone present. The defense attorney's face turned pale. He scrambled for composure. "Objection," he barked. "This is outrageous. This child is 3 years old. She doesn't even understand what she's saying." But his objection rang hollow, even to his own ears. The jurors had seen it, the fear in Maddie's eyes, the way her voice cracked, the way she drew strength from Rex to speak. No amount of legal maneuvering could erase the authenticity of that moment. The judge struck his gavel again. "The objection is overruled." Maddie's small chest rose and fell quickly, her breathing ragged. She buried her face into Rex's fur, and the dog remained still, his steady heartbeat grounding her. The courtroom watched in silence, transfixed. The prosecutor stepped back, allowing the weight of her words to hang in the air. He didn't need to press further, not yet. The jury already looked shaken, their faces pale with the gravity of what they'd just heard. In that silence, in that storm of unspoken emotion, the truth had been laid bare. A child's voice, fragile, trembling, but unbreakable, had cut through every doubt, every shadow, every smirk on the defense attorney's lips. The storm had broken, and the courtroom would never be the same. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier now, as if every breath carried the weight of Maddie's trembling words. The prosecutor had stepped back, giving the child a moment of rest, but her tiny voice, "I saw him," still echoed inside everyone's minds. Some of the jurors kept glancing at her, unable to hide their astonishment that such a small child could deliver testimony so raw and piercing. Rex, ever vigilant, had not moved from his place at Maddie's feet. His head rested on his paws, but his eyes scanned the room with a steady calmness, as though even he knew the storm was not yet over. Maddie's hand never left his fur. She clutched her teddy bear in the other arm, the two symbols of her safety anchoring her in this vast, intimidating room. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, nodding respectfully to the judge, then turned back toward Maddie. His voice softened, as though speaking to his own daughter. "Maddie, you've been so brave. You told us you saw someone that night. Can you tell us what happened before that? What did you hear?" Her lips trembled, her small chest rising and falling with each nervous breath. For a moment, she looked down at her shoes, as if the memory was too heavy to lift. But then Rex shifted closer, pressing his body against the witness stand. The girl's hand slid deeper into his fur, and she seemed to draw courage from the simple, silent presence at her side. "There was shouting," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but she continued. "Mommy said, 'Hide, Maddie.' So I went under the table. I closed my eyes, but—" She hesitated. A single tear slipped down her cheek. The courtroom was so silent that the sound of the tear dripping onto her dress seemed almost audible. "But I still saw him." The prosecutor gave her a gentle nod. But before he could ask his next question, the defense attorney shot up from his chair, his voice sharp and dripping with contempt. "Your Honor, I object again. This child is 3 years old. She can't possibly understand what she's saying. This testimony is unreliable and prejudicial." The judge, clearly irritated, leaned forward. "Mr. Davis, we've already discussed this. A jury will weigh the credibility of the witness." Objection overruled. The defense attorney clenched his jaw. His client leaned in close, whispering angrily in his ear. The attorney nodded, then smoothed his suit jacket and turned back toward the child, this time with a different strategy. "Permission to cross-examine?" he asked. The judge nodded reluctantly. "Proceed, but remember the witness is a child. Restrain your tone." The defense attorney walked slowly toward the stand, his smile thin, his eyes cold. Maddie shrank back, pressing closer to Rex. The German shepherd's head lifted, his ears pricking forward, as though reading the tension in the man's body. "Hello, Maddie," the attorney said in a syrupy tone, crouching down just enough to look less intimidating. "You're very little, aren't you?" "Only 3 years old." Maddie nodded slightly, her eyes darting between the man and Rex. "You must get scared sometimes, right?" He continued. "Sometimes when people shout, or when the lights are dark, you might think you see something that isn't really there. Isn't that true?" Maddie bit her lip, hugging her teddy closer. The defense attorney's smirk grew. He thought he had her. But Rex shifted again, nudging Maddie's knee. Her small hand slid down to his head, stroking his fur. And when she looked back at the defense attorney, something in her eyes had changed. "I know what I saw," she said firmly. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. The defense attorney's smirk faltered. "You know what you saw?" He repeated, his tone sharpening. "Maddie, you're only 3. You can't even read yet, can you? How can you be sure you really saw my client?" Maddie tilted her head, her brow furrowed in innocent confusion. "I don't need to read," she said softly, but clearly. "I saw his face." The silence that followed was deafening. The prosecutor hid a smile behind his papers. The victim's family leaned forward, their eyes glistening with tears. Even the judge seemed struck by the child's quiet conviction. The defense attorney tried to recover, pacing slowly. But faces can be tricky, can't they? Sometimes people look alike. Maybe it was someone else. Maddie's grip on Rex tightened. She shook her head. "It was him. I remember." Her small voice cut through the lawyer's words like a blade. The attorney's tone hardened. "Maddie, Did anyone tell you to say that? Did Mommy tell you to point at that man? The jury stiffened. The question hung dangerously in the air. But Maddie didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her pigtails quivering slightly with the movement. No, she said, her voice steadier than before. Mommy said I could tell the truth. Rex said I was brave. A ripple of surprise swept through the courtroom. Several jurors exchanged emotional looks. Maddie hadn't been coached. Her words carried the unmistakable purity of innocence. The defense attorney's face reddened. He turned back toward the judge. Your Honor, this testimony is beyond prejudicial. This child is clearly being influenced by a dog, for heaven's sake. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Davis, you are dangerously close to insulting the intelligence of the jury. Overruled. Continue if you dare, but tread carefully. The defense attorney swallowed hard. His attempt to dismantle Maddie's words was failing, and worse, it was backfiring. The jury was no longer looking at Maddie with doubt. They were looking at her with admiration. Meanwhile, Maddie leaned down and whispered something into Rex's ear. No one else could hear, but the dog's tail gave a faint wag, and the little girl smiled for the first time since she entered the courtroom. The prosecutor, sensing victory, rose again. Maddie, just one more question, he said gently. Can you tell us why you're here today? Why it's important to talk to us? Maddie's gaze swept the room, her small body trembling but her voice unwavering. Because bad people shouldn't hurt good people, she said. And because Mommy said telling the truth makes you strong. Her words landed with the weight of a gavel. The jury's faces softened, some visibly moved. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. Even the stoic bailiff looked away, blinking rapidly. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Maddie. You've been very brave. The judge leaned forward, his expression unusually warm. Young lady, you've shown more courage than most adults ever do in this room. As Maddie was excused, she slid off the giant chair, clutching her teddy tightly. Rex rose immediately, walking beside her with measured steps. Together, the little girl and her loyal guardian left the stand, their bond shining brighter than any legal argument could. And though the defense attorney tried to look unfazed, everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. The child had spoken, and no one, not even the most seasoned lawyer, could undo the power of her words. The doors of the courtroom closed softly behind Maddie as she was escorted back to her mother, Rex padding loyally at her side. For a long, suspended moment, the room remained silent, the weight of her testimony pressing down on everyone inside. Even after she had gone, the sound of her soft but steady words still lingered, echoing louder than any lawyer's argument could. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the trance. Let the record reflect that the witness has concluded her testimony. His gavel tapped lightly, as though he too respected the gravity of what had just happened. Jurors shifted in their seats, some wiping discreet tears. The prosecutor sat back, his face calm but triumphant. He knew he didn't need to gloat. The child had done what no adult could. She had delivered truth in its purest form. The defense table, however, looked like a storm cloud had settled over it. The accused, a broad-shouldered man with cold, calculating eyes, leaned close to his attorney, whispering furiously. His jaw tightened with each passing second, his glare darting toward the jury, as if willing them to forget what they'd heard. Your Honor, the defense attorney finally said, rising abruptly. His voice was strained, the slick confidence from earlier fading into something more desperate. The prosecution's reliance on the testimony of a 3-year-old is nothing short of outrageous. A child of that age is highly impressionable, vulnerable to suggestion, and incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. The prosecutor leaned forward, ready to object, but the judge raised his hand. I'll allow you to make your record, Mr. Davis. Proceed. The attorney paced before the jury, hands clasped dramatically behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to consider this carefully. Yes, the little girl was sweet. Yes, she seemed brave. But bravery does not equal reliability. Are we truly to decide the fate of a man based on the words of a toddler? One who, by her own admission, was frightened, hiding under a table and accompanied by a dog? Can we call that credible?" Some jurors frowned, glancing at one another. The attorney pounced on their hesitation. Children are known to imagine things. They can be coached intentionally or not by well-meaning parents. They want to please adults. Ask yourselves, was that testimony genuine memory, or was it the product of fear and influence? He let the words hang in the air, then straightened his jacket, convinced he had planted doubt. But then the prosecutor stood, his tone steady, almost fatherly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, walking slowly to the center of the room. "You saw her. You heard her. That was not rehearsed. That was not manufactured. That was innocence unfiltered. Did she sound like someone parroting words fed to her? Or did she sound like a child, reliving something no child should ever have to relive?" He paused, his voice lowering. "We ask children to tell the truth. We tell them to be brave. Yesterday, we might not have believed a 3-year-old could do that in a courtroom like this. But today, she proved us wrong." The room fell still again. The jury's eyes softened, turning not toward the defense, but toward the memory of the little girl and the police dog who had given her courage. The defense attorney's jaw clenched. He had to shift his strategy. "Your Honor," he said quickly. "At this time, the defense moves to strike the child's testimony from the record." "Motion denied," the judge replied firmly. "The jury will give it the weight they deem appropriate." The accused slammed his fist quietly against the defense table. His composure cracked just enough for the jurors to notice, and several of them stiffened at the sight. It was as though Maddie's words had already stripped away the mask he had worn throughout the trial. The prosecutor wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I'd like to recall Officer Daniels." The bailiff opened the door, and a tall, broad-shouldered police officer entered. His uniform was pressed sharp, his presence commanding, but his eyes carried a softness that contrasted his stature. He saluted the judge, then took his seat at the witness stand. "Officer Daniels," the prosecutor began, "you were present during Maddie's interview at the station, correct?" "Yes, sir," the officer replied, his voice steady. "And was the child's statement today consistent with what she said then?" The officer nodded. "Exactly consistent. The details matched. And I'll add this, she never wavered, not once. Even when we asked gently, even when we tried to confirm if she might be mistaken, she stuck to the truth. Children that young don't fake conviction like that. They simply say what they remember." The prosecutor nodded. "And the presence of the comfort dog Rex, did you observe how he impacted her ability to speak?" "Yes," the officer said. "Without Rex, she was withdrawn, terrified. But with him, she had the courage to speak. That bond gave her strength." The jurors listened intently, nodding almost unconsciously. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. "Officer Daniels, you're aware that children that age are highly susceptible to suggestion?" "I'm aware, yes," the officer replied calmly. "And you're also aware that her mother was in the room during questioning?" "Yes." "And isn't it possible the mother influenced her daughter's answers?" The officer's gaze hardened. "No, sir. Maddie's answers came from Maddie. You can tell the difference." The defense attorney scowled, but the damage was done. The jury could sense that every attempt to undermine Maddie's testimony only reinforced its authenticity. By the time Officer Daniels stepped down, the defense's case looked weaker than ever. The jurors weren't just hearing evidence anymore, they were feeling it. They had seen the child's courage, and now they saw professionals validate it. The judge called for a recess, his gavel striking firmly. The jurors filed out, but not without one last glance at the defense table, where the accused sat stiff and stone-faced, sweat gathering at his temples. In the hallway outside, Maddie sat in her mother's lap, Rex lying protectively at their feet. She was giggling softly now, the tension of the courtroom behind her, unaware of the magnitude of what she had just done. Her mother kissed her head, whispering, "You did so good, baby. You were so brave." Rex lifted his head, his dark eyes alert, watching everyone who passed, as though he alone bore the responsibility of guarding the little girl who had just shaken a courtroom with her voice. Inside the courtroom, however, the whispers had already begun among the jurors and spectators alike. Everyone knew it now. The trial had shifted. Not because of lawyers or technicalities, but because of the undeniable courage of a child one too young to spell her own name, but strong enough to speak the truth when it mattered most. The defense would fight harder in the days to come. They would claw at every shred of doubt, trying to rebuild their fractured case. But no matter what happened next, one thing was certain. The smallest witness had already become the strongest voice, and the courtroom would never be the same again. The courtroom reconvened after recess, but the atmosphere was different now. The tension, once sharp and brittle, had grown heavy, like a storm cloud pressing down on the room. Jurors filed back into their seats quietly, their expressions thoughtful, shaken by the bravery they had witnessed earlier. Reporters scribbled hurried notes, their pens flying across paper, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. At the prosecution's table, confidence radiated. The prosecutor leaned forward, whispering to his team. He knew the turning point had already arrived. Maddie's testimony had pierced through layers of doubt, reaching the jury's hearts in a way no adult ever could. The defense table, however, was a picture of strain. The accused sat stiffly, his eyes darting from juror to juror, as if searching for even the smallest glimmer of sympathy. But none came. His attorney, Mr. Davis, massaged his temples, deep lines of frustration etching his face. He had battled witnesses, destroyed alibis, and dismantled arguments in his career, but how could he fight the words of a 3-year-old? The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice echoing through the chamber. Court is now back in session. Prosecution, you may proceed. The prosecutor rose. Your Honor, at this time, the state requests to recall the witness, Maddie Thompson, for a brief clarification. Gasps rippled through the room. The jurors leaned forward, shocked. The child again? Surely she had already given more than enough. But the prosecutor's tone was calm, almost reverent. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Very well. But keep it brief and mindful of the witness's age. The bailiff opened the door. Moments later, Maddie appeared once more, holding her mother's hand. Rex trotted faithfully beside her, his presence steady and grounding. The little girl's pigtails bobbed as she walked, her teddy bear clutched tight. The courtroom held its breath. She climbed back into the oversized witness chair, her feet dangling several inches from the ground. Rex settled at her side, resting his chin on her lap as if sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. The prosecutor approached gently. Maddie, thank you for being so brave today. I just want to ask you one more question. Earlier, you told us you saw the man who hurt your mommy. Do you remember? Maddie nodded, her eyes wide and solemn. Can you tell us, the prosecutor continued softly, how you know it was him? The question hung in the air, simple yet heavy. The defense attorney bristled, ready to object, but something in Maddie's face silenced him. The little girl leaned closer to the microphone. Her voice, though small, carried across the hushed courtroom. Because he talked to me. The room froze. The jurors stiffened, their eyes widening in shock. The prosecutor blinked, momentarily thrown off. Even the judge leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Maddie's mother gasped softly from the gallery, covering her mouth. The prosecutor crouched slightly, lowering himself to Maddie's level. "Maddie, can you tell us what he said?" Her small hands trembled. She looked down at Rex, stroking his ears, gathering courage. Then, with a trembling breath, she spoke. "He looked at me," she whispered, "and he said, 'If you tell anyone, I'll hurt you too.'" A collective gasp erupted across the courtroom. Jurors exchanged horrified glances. One woman pressed a hand to her chest. A man shook his head in disbelief. The accused shifted uncomfortably at the defense table, his composure unraveling. His face flushed red, his eyes narrowing into slits. The prosecutor's voice was steady, though his heart pounded. "Maddie, are you certain it was him?" Maddie's tiny hand lifted. She pointed, her finger trembling, but unmistakably aimed at the accused. "It was him," she said. "I remember his eyes." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to stop moving. The judge exhaled slowly, his gavel resting heavily in his hand. The defense attorney scrambled to his feet, his voice breaking the stillness. "Objection. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay, manipulation. She's a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But his voice rang hollow against the crushing weight of Maddie's words. The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Davis, sit down." His tone was firm, his eyes narrowing at the defense table. "The witness has answered the question. The jury will decide the weight." The defense attorney's face paled. He sat heavily, defeated. The prosecutor, his voice now filled with quiet strength, addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the unvarnished truth. A 3-year-old child, with no reason to lie, told you exactly what happened. Fear, intimidation, and the cruelty of a man who thought he could silence innocence. But she wasn't silenced. She found her courage with the help of Rex, and she spoke the truth." He gestured gently toward Maddie. "That is the power of courage. That is the power of justice." Maddie's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. She sat there, clutching Rex, her small body radiating a strength far beyond her years. The jurors stared at her with awe, as though they were witnessing something holy. The judge finally leaned forward. His voice softened, almost breaking protocol. "Maddie, thank you. You've done something very important today. You may step down now." Her mother rushed forward, scooping her into her arms. Maddie clung to her tightly, Rex walking faithfully beside them as they exited the courtroom. But the shock Maddie had delivered remained. The jurors sat frozen, their faces etched with disbelief and determination. They had heard threats, intimidation, cruelty, but not from a lawyer or officer. From the innocent lips of a child. And it was undeniable. The accused leaned back in his chair, beads of sweat forming on his brow. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. He could see it, the tide had turned. His secrets, his threats, his cruelty had been exposed by the smallest, most fragile witness imaginable. The defense attorney rubbed his forehead, staring at his notes as though the paper itself might offer salvation. But he knew. Deep down, he knew the case was slipping away, unraveling faster than he could mend. The courtroom remained still long after Maddie left, each person processing what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just testimony. It was revelation, and it left everyone frozen. For a long suspended moment, the courtroom remained utterly still. It was as if Maddie's small voice had pressed pause on the entire world. Jurors sat frozen, eyes wide, their gazes locked on the spot where the little girl had sat only moments ago. Reporters lowered their pens, forgetting to write. Even the judge, a man who had presided over decades of criminal trials, seemed shaken, his gavel hovering above the desk, but never striking. The silence was suffocating. No coughs, no shuffling of papers, just the heavy echo of her words replaying inside every mind present. "If you tell anyone, I'll hurt you too." Those words had cut deeper than evidence, deeper than testimony from adults, deeper than any polished argument. They revealed intent, cruelty, and guilt with a clarity no legal jargon could obscure. The accused shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his composure fracturing. For the first time since the trial began, fear flickered in his eyes. His jaw clenched and his fingers tapped nervously against the table. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but the man's blank stare suggested he wasn't listening. At the prosecution's table, the attorneys exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of triumph and astonishment. They hadn't expected Maddie's revelation either. They had simply intended to reinforce her credibility, but instead, she had delivered the blow that might end the trial altogether. The defense attorney finally broke the silence, his voice sharp, desperate, louder than intended. "Your Honor, the jury must not take the ramblings of a frightened child as evidence of guilt. This is outrageous, highly prejudicial." The judge's gavel struck down, loud and sharp. "Order! Sit down, Mr. Davis." But Davis didn't sit. His voice wavered with panic. "She's 3 years old. 3. She doesn't know what she's saying. She doesn't understand threats or memory. This is nothing more than a fairy tale twisted into testimony." The jurors flinched. His words sounded harsh, almost cruel. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Davis, one more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt," the witness testified. "The jury will decide the weight of her statement. That is the law. Now sit." Davis sat, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. His attempt to control the narrative had collapsed, and worse, it had alienated the jury. They weren't looking at him with understanding. They were glaring at him with cold disapproval. In the gallery, whispers broke out. Spectators leaned close to one another, murmuring, shaking their heads. The story of Maddie's testimony was already alive in the room, spreading like fire. The prosecutor stood slowly, his voice calm, but charged with gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you heard it for yourselves. That wasn't coached. That wasn't rehearsed. That was the unfiltered truth of a child who had nothing to gain and everything to fear. That's the kind of truth you can't fake. That's the kind of truth this man," he gestured firmly toward the accused, "tried to silence." The jurors looked at the accused, their eyes narrowing. Some shifted uncomfortably, as though merely being near him unsettled them. The accused muttered under his breath, glaring at the prosecutor. His fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles whitened. For a moment, the courtroom wondered if he might erupt then and there. But he remained in his seat, tethered by the weight of eyes upon him. The judge leaned back in his chair, his voice steady but solemn. "The testimony stands. The jury will recall it during deliberation." And yet, the air didn't move. Everyone in that courtroom, judge, jury, attorneys, spectators, remained frozen. It wasn't just the testimony itself. It was who had given it. A 3-year-old, the smallest and most vulnerable among them, had pierced through the hardened walls of the judicial system and laid bare the truth with devastating simplicity. The defense attorney tried to collect himself. He rose again, his voice low this time, careful. "Your Honor, with respect, I request that the jury be instructed to consider the reliability of such testimony with extreme caution." The judge nodded. "The jury will, of course, weigh all testimony carefully, as is their duty." But even as he said it, the jury's faces told a different story. Maddie's trembling voice had already imprinted itself on their minds. It wasn't something they could file away under caution. It was something they felt. The prosecution, sensing the power of silence, chose not to press further. Instead, they allowed Maddie's words to hang in the room, heavier than any closing argument could ever be. The judge finally called for an early adjournment. Court will recess until tomorrow morning. Jurors, remember my instructions. Do not discuss the case with anyone. The gavel struck, but it did little to break the spell. Jurors rose slowly, as if reluctant to move, their eyes lingering on the empty witness stand where Maddie had sat. Reporters scrambled for the doors, already whispering headlines. Spectators shook their heads, whispering about the cruelty of threatening a child, about the courage it took for her to reveal it. The accused was led out in cuffs, his jaw tight, his eyes darting nervously. Gone was the smugness he had carried at the start of the trial. In its place was a shadow of fear. He glanced once toward the gallery, but his gaze didn't meet sympathy. It met only cold stares of condemnation. Outside the courtroom, Maddie sat in her mother's lap in a quiet waiting area, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. She played absent-mindedly with Rex's ears, giggling softly. Her mother stroked her hair, whispering, "You were so brave, sweetheart. You did what no one else could." Rex lay at their feet, his eyes watchful, his presence a wall of protection. He seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened, his body tense yet calm, guarding the little girl who had spoken truth to power. Inside the courthouse, lawyers, clerks, and even seasoned officers talked in hushed tones about what they had just seen. They had all witnessed countless testimonies, but this was different. This was raw. This was unforgettable. By the time the jurors returned home, Maddie's words echoed in their minds. Some replayed them over dinner. Others sat in silence, unable to shake the sound of her voice. One juror confessed privately to his spouse, "I've never seen courage like that. Not from an adult, and certainly not from a child." The trial wasn't over yet. Closing arguments loomed. The defense still had their turn to claw back whatever credibility they could salvage. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The case had shifted. Not because of forensic evidence, not because of clever arguments, because of a 3-year-old who had looked fear in the eye, clutched her dog for strength, and spoken the words that froze an entire courtroom in place. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with a restless energy. Everyone knew today would be decisive. Reporters had gathered early, their cameras flashing as attorneys filed in. Word of Maddie's testimony had spread beyond the courtroom walls, making its way into newspapers, television, and social media. People whispered outside the doors, "Did you hear what the little girl said?" Inside, the tension was so thick it felt almost physical, pressing down on every chest. The jurors returned to their seats, solemn and weary. They had carried Maddie's voice home with them the night before, and it had kept many awake. The defense attorney sat stiffly, stacks of notes in front of him, though his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. Across from him, the prosecution appeared calm, almost serene, their case now resting on a truth that could not be undone. Then the doors opened, and Maddie entered with her mother and Rex. Though she wasn't scheduled to testify again, her presence reminded everyone why they were here. She clutched her mother's hand, her tiny steps slow but steady. Rex padded faithfully beside her, his nose nudging her knee as if to reassure her that she wasn't alone. The judge entered, and silence swept the room. The gavel struck. Court is now in session. We will proceed with closing arguments before the jury retires to deliberate. The prosecution's closing argument, the prosecutor rose first. His voice was calm, measured, but infused with a quiet power. He didn't pace or shout. Instead, he spoke with a gravity that pulled every ear toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "over the past several days, you have heard evidence, seen testimony, and witnessed a child's courage. The law asks you to weigh all of it carefully. to decide guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But sometimes, truth reveals itself not in the clever words of lawyers, not in documents or technical jargon, but in the trembling voice of a child who dares to speak despite her fear. He paused, letting the words settle. You saw Maddie. You saw her courage. You heard her repeat the exact words of the accused. If you tell anyone, I'll hurt you too. That was not a mistake. That was not imagination. That was fear, real and raw. And it came from only one place, the man sitting right there. He turned, pointing deliberately at the defendant. The defense will ask you to doubt her. They'll say she's too young, too impressionable. But think, did she look confused to you? Did she seem coached, rehearsed? Or did she seem like a little girl, clutching her dog, holding on with all the strength she had to tell you something no child should ever have to say? That's not rehearsed truth. That's lived truth. The prosecutor's voice dropped, quiet but piercing. The law is clear. The evidence is clear. But more than that, the conscience is clear. Do not let this child's bravery be in vain. Deliver the justice she, and every victim like her, deserves. He sat, and the room remained silent. The defense's closing argument. The defense attorney rose, his face drawn, his voice careful, as though he knew the battle was already lost. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I know what you are feeling. I saw it yesterday. I felt it too. Maddie's testimony was heartbreaking. No one doubts her sincerity. But sincerity is not the same as truth. Memory is fragile. Children are imaginative. They absorb stories, suggestions, fears, and retell them as if they were real. That's not their fault, it's their nature. He took a breath, searching the jurors' eyes for a flicker of sympathy. Ask yourselves, are you ready to convict a man for the rest of his life based on the words of a 3-year-old child? Can you honestly say her testimony leaves no room for doubt? The law demands proof beyond reasonable doubt, not emotion beyond endurance. His words hung in the air, but they lacked conviction. He sounded like a man trying to put out a wildfire with a single glass of water. Consider carefully, he finished, because a verdict of guilt must be based on evidence, not pity. Thank you. He sat down, avoiding the defendant's glare. Deliberation. The judge gave his final instructions, then dismissed the jury to deliberate. Hours passed. The courtroom emptied and refilled, reporters pacing outside, families waiting, the weight of justice pressing heavily. Maddie's mother held her close, whispering reassurances while Rex kept watch, his golden eyes alert. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors wrestled. Some tried to cling to the defense's plea for doubt, but Maddie's voice echoed relentlessly. One juror finally said, if we don't believe her, if we don't believe that child, then who can we believe? The room fell silent. Heads nodded. The decision, though heavy, became clear. The verdict at last, the bailiff's call rang out. All rise. The jurors filed back in, their faces solemn but resolved. The foreperson held a folded paper in trembling hands. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. The clerk took the paper, read it, and handed it to the judge. He nodded gravely, then returned it. In the matter of the state versus James Carter, the foreperson read, her voice steady, though her hands shook. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. The words struck like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the room. Maddie's mother covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. The prosecutor closed his eyes in relief. The defendant erupted, shouting, "This is a setup, a lie." But deputies restrained him swiftly, dragging him away as he kicked and cursed. His protests only underscored the image of a guilty man unraveling. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order," Order in the court. The chaos quieted, leaving behind the sound of Maddie's soft laughter as she buried her face in Rex's fur, unaware of the monumental victory her small voice had delivered. Aftermath outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with reporters. The prosecutor addressed them briefly. Justice was served today, not because of lawyers or evidence, but because of the courage of a little girl who spoke the truth. When asked about Maddie, he smiled faintly. She reminded us all of something important, that innocence can be stronger than intimidation, and that sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths. Inside a quiet corridor, Maddie sat on a bench with her mother and Rex. She didn't understand verdicts or prison sentences. What she understood was that people smiled now instead of frowning, that her mother cried happy tears, and that Rex wagged his tail, proud and protective. Her mother knelt, cupping her daughter's face. "Sweetheart, you are so brave. Because of you, no one else will get hurt." Maddie tilted her head. "Can we go home now?" Her mother smiled through tears. "Yes, baby. We can go home." Rex barked softly, as if to seal the promise. The lasting memory weeks later, when the case faded from headlines, people still spoke about it. Not about the attorneys or the judge, not even about the defendant. They spoke about Maddie, the little girl who had walked into a courtroom with her dog and said the words that stopped everyone in their tracks. For the jurors, it became a story they would carry for life. For the community, it was a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a child's trembling voice. And for Maddie, though she would grow up and one day only faintly remember the trial, she would never forget Rex, the faithful companion who stood by her side when the world was watching.